When visitors look to relax on the Delmarva Peninsula, most usually head to the coastal towns along the Atlantic or Chesapeake Bay. But a few head for the peninsula's more open interior. They seek a less predictable form of fun, found in a sport unique to the region, one that was built, shaped, and still survives because of the Delmarva community passionate about it.
As soon as people were building cars, they wanted to race them. They wanted to test them. They wanted to see if they could outpace their competitors in both terms of manufacturers and just people who were fellow car owners.
The first automobiles were very expensive and were concentrated in wealthier urban areas. Indianapolis, Indiana, which had 60 competing car manufacturing companies by 1910, established itself as an early mecca of auto racing with the inaugural running of the Indianapolis 500 in 1911.
At the beginning, automobile racing was more of a white-collar professional sport because only the people who could afford to own the cars, these big European cars, were the ones that could participate in the racing. And sometimes they would serve as car owners, giving men from a lower socioeconomic background the opportunity to participate in racing. But it took until about the mid-1920s until more parts are available, and then more men started to be able to participate at a lower grassroots level.
Henry Ford's Model T not only mobilized the nation, it supplied rural racers with a cheap solution. By 1918, half of all cars on American roads were Model Ts, which also filled junkyards with plenty of used parts for aspiring racing mechanics.
In the Mid-Atlantic region, we already had all of these horse tracks that were available and used at agricultural fairs. So those tracks became a great place then to start to race automobiles. It was very accessible that the tracks were already built. It didn't take a lot of extra time to prepare the racetracks for the automobiles as opposed to the horses. And people started then bringing their automobiles to the county and state fairs in order to challenge each other in these automobile races on the tracks.
This is an early example of a sprint car from the 1920s. This car was owned by John Gerber, a famous race driver in the Midwest. Specifically, he was from Iowa. But what I really enjoy about this car is the primitive nature and putting yourself in a driver's state of mind to climb behind the wheel of this thing and compete. To me, it gives a whole new concept to what bravery was, and perhaps even bordering on the lunacy just a little bit.
The risk-taking involved in automobile racing fits into a couple of categories. One is that it's by choice. In other words, it's elective risk-taking, and it's at its core is recreation, fun. In other words, nobody has to get behind the wheel of a race car on a Saturday night and go round and round in circles. It doesn't in any direct way contribute to the survival of us as a species or as individuals. And psychologists have researched this kind of elective risk-taking, and they say that people understand that kind of elective risk-taking in a very different way. People who participate in that kind of risk-taking see it as inherently less dangerous because it's by choice.
One of the unique features of this car is that it had no back end. This is not a cutaway for display. This is the way the cars were raced. They literally had no back. This car, of course, would have had a steering wheel, and you can see that it just has casting in there for an engine. But the fact that the car had no back end just amazes me that someone would sit in this car, go around a dirt track in the middle of the Midwest, and say he had a fun day.
When new technologies are introduced, typically the way that people understand them is by analogy to what they already know. And in the case of automobiles, the analogy, of course, was to horses and carriages. And you could see that in the physical structure of cars, but you can also see it in the way that people dealt with them and their expectations about acceptable levels of risk.
Horse tracks didn't have a lot of those safety features because it wasn't necessary. So you have then cars racing at higher speeds on these tracks with very little guardrail or fencing in order to keep the drivers on the track. So you have cars flying off the speedways into spectator areas or other areas in the infield of the track.
In this area, you see what they had. They had a set of goggles, a leather helmet that would have done absolutely nothing but hold the blood in if you got hit with a rock or tipped upside down. There was no roll cage, as you can see, but they were very sporting and wore bow ties with a white shirt during the racing event.
Driver's protection in the 1920s is very limited. You have men who are basically racing in short-sleeve t-shirts in their open cockpit cars. There's a lot of ideas at the beginning that you didn't want to be belted into your car because when the cars would flip, you have a lot of gasoline, a lot of heavy machinery then that would land on top of these drivers. So drivers thought it was better to be actually thrown from the vehicles during a collision. But the problem then is that they're not wearing helmets or other safety features. And you see a lot of skull fractures and other upper body injuries as these men would be thrown from their vehicles in a collision and thrown onto the track or onto oncoming cars.
I just can't imagine how brave, like in the courage that it took to do this in the early ages of auto racing. It was just amazing, but I will say that there are many, many cases that they did not survive the experience.
Dirt track racing in the Mid-Atlantic started in the 1920s when there was an interest in having automobile races at county and state fairs. So they would bring cars to the horse tracks to be able to have races in addition to the horse races at the yearly agricultural expositions. They like to see the cars go fast, the bright colors, the sounds of the engines, the dirt, the dust. It's a full sensory experience that drew people then to the track. And these automobile races quickly became the most profitable events at the fairs.
Delaware had two large annual fair events, the State Fair in Wilmington and the Kent-Sussex Fair in Harrington. Both offered the state's growing fan base an opportunity, albeit limited, to experience this fledgling sport.
And what's fascinating is they're not only seeing Delaware drivers race, they're seeing drivers from surrounding states. Since it was under a AAA sanction, you have some of these bigger name drivers that you'd read about in the newspapers, men who competed in the Indianapolis 500 when they're not racing on that top level, competing on the fairground circuit. So it's really an opportunity for people in Delaware to see these very famous drivers. And then they could follow the drivers that they connected with throughout the rest of the racing season. So they had a fan favorite, and they would come back year after year to watch these local drivers compete against the more nationally known drivers that were on the AAA tour.
World War II shifted the nation's auto manufacturers from car production to supplying the war effort. Cars were in short supply, and gas rationing meant that auto racing came to a halt. But with the war's end, Detroit quickly went back to building cars, and race fans returned to their tracks.
A bunch of war vets came back with skills, skills they learned in the military, mechanical skills, engineering skills, a sense for adventure, a sense for escape from what they've seen in the war, and came back, and auto racing was the perfect habitat for that. So in the late 40s, you had a lot of people plowing up fields and making race courses. Most of those only lasted a year or two, some not even that.
There was a farm called the Tull Farm down in Allen, Maryland, where I was born and raised. It was nothing but a farm field. And Miss Edna Tull run that place. She had a great big white stallion. It cost you $1 a carload to get in. Most of the people drove their car in, taped their headlights so they didn't crack them, and put a tape on the side of the car, and they raced out in this field. You couldn't see nothing for dust. There was no guardrails. There were no announcing booths. It was just tape a number on it and go race, if you could see.
Wartime rationing also had another effect. Worn-out pre-war automobiles now quickly filled post-war junkyards as Detroit's new models appeared. These junkers were a bonanza for race car mechanics who adapted them for weekly racing. These became known as stock cars or street stocks, meaning they were built from the standard passenger cars originally produced by the automakers.
So it was relatively inexpensive for people to race at that time because they would use junkyard parts. They would use cars from the 30s, 1932 Fords, 34 Fords, whatever. And they would use stock components, stock frames, basically stock engines and stock bodies.
40 Fords were available, 37 Fords. So you had guys cutting up these cars and essentially making stock cars or modifying their cars, and thus the term modified was born.
When stock car racing starts to be introduced in the late 40s and early 1950s, those are the lowest divisions of cars at tracks in central Pennsylvania. In other parts of the Mid-Atlantic, including Delaware, you don't have as strong of a tradition then of open-wheel racing, because those tracks didn't develop after the war to race open-wheel cars on a weekly basis. Instead, they developed to race stock cars.
Of those, we only have two now, and that one of them certainly being Georgetown Speedway, which started its life just east of Georgetown.
That track was located on what is now Route 9, right across from where the starting gate. It's a horse track. Boots Wilkins owned it. Alan Tigg and my father promoted the first race there. We raced there probably 4 times, maybe 5 times. And then Melvin built his track, and Boots' track went back to horses.
Melvin was Melvin Joseph, a remarkable entrepreneur and businessman who was one of the most influential figures in the history of Sussex County. Fortunately, he was passionate about car racing.
He got tired of racing on everybody else's track, so he decided it was time to build his own, and he thought he knew how to build it better than anybody else, which he did. It wasn't in the middle of a cornfield. It wasn't just dug out and you do it. He wanted to make it so it would be racing and you could put on a good show. So he started building in 49. Actually, the first race wasn't till 1950.
But like other tracks, Georgetown only raced one night a week. Local drivers in the area's growing fan base wanted more racing.
You have still a continuation of those fair tracks, but what you see is a change from racing only biannually at the fairgrounds to more weekly racing, either Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday afternoons, that draw people to the racetrack every weekend. And you still have then men that have 9 to 5 jobs during the week. You don't have a lot of professional race car drivers during this time. People have other sources of income, and they see racing as more of a hobby, something to do on the weekends with their entire family.
For those living on rural Delmarva, the weekly races were a special family outing. And given the historic influence of the peninsula's geographic isolation and sparse population, family meant more than just the wife and kids.
In Sussex County, it's hard to find somebody that ain't related to you. Really, in all honesty. Back in the day, I was flagging, and George Reed come to me and he says, "Bill, why don't we get us some referees out there so that we can make sure all of our calls are fair for everybody?" I said, "George, that's a good idea. But you tell me who you going to put out there that's not related to one of them guys out on that racetrack." Because Susie married Johnny, and Johnny married James, and it's everybody's related to everybody. So it's a family sport.
The ones of us gotten involved in it, those names are still involved. That now we're to the point, like, we talked about Harold and Bobby Wilkins, and it's always been a generation passing down. We're in our 3rd or 4th generation now of when we all started or where we are now.
My dad was one of the first directors of racing here. I got into racing. Now my son is racing in Little Lincoln, and my grandson is into go-karts. That's 4 generations. So it's family. It's deep.
The close relationship of extended families to Delaware dirt track racing has also been aided by the state's reluctance to restrict fan access to the pits, the track area where the cars are prepared for racing. Unlike neighboring states, Delaware has never imposed age restrictions on fans wanting to get a closer look at the cars, meet the drivers, and their teams. To this day, the state's ruling has meant that at its core, Delaware racing has always fostered a close-knit and intimate community.
When you walk in the pits, you immediately see families. You'll see kids helping dad put the tire on the car, and families working as a whole. You know, you might see grandpa tuning the engine, while someone else is tuning the shocks or, putting the thing on the car. So it does create a unique atmosphere. It creates a family atmosphere. And you have to think that's what made racing so popular in the first place. You look back at some of the old photos and see people after church in their best dressed, coming to the track as a family.
Family involvement also included managing the tracks, which continued to draw ever larger crowds.
Yeah, there's crowds all the time. Now, my grandfather used to park the cars. He wouldn't have them any other than just in straight lines. They had to be parked correctly. One of my aunts sold tickets. Everybody in the family helped out some way.
Melvin had the premier track around. There's no second guessing that. And that's where the Stofas, the Martins, Kerry Williams out of Virginia Beach, Dean Pelton, Red Skagel, Glenn Guthrie raced there, Johnny Roberts raced there, Joe Weberly raced there, Ralph Moody raced there. Georgetown has got a long list of heroes that came up through dirt track racing to what is today. And at one point in time, if you didn't race Georgetown, you weren't going to be a NASCAR modified champion.
The National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, was in its infancy when Georgetown Speedway opened in 1950. NASCAR had been organized by a promoter, Big Bill France, for several purposes, one being to make racing more competitive by standardizing the rules for race car equipment.
In most cases in auto racing, what enables you to beat the other guy are technical developments that you had on your car that somebody else didn't have. So you would have a new tire, you would have a new steering box that would enable you to handle the car better, different suspensions. So as people tried to beat the other competitors, the tracks came in as the organizations that controlled the racing and established rules.
But each track had its own set of rules. This meant that a driver's car might be legal to run on one track, but not on another nearby, which limited that driver's ability to race.
NASCAR was really the one that kind of take it on a national level and say that, the rules are the same here as they are in Florida. So that created guys traveling around a lot and moving out of the area and trying to race these bigger races. And they know if they went from here and they went and raced at Langhorne, Pennsylvania, that their car would be legal and be competitive.
Melvin agreed with Big Bill's vision and had met him in Daytona, Florida, where France promoted the city's annual auto race. The two hit it off, and Melvin made a serious effort to ensure the success of France's early NASCAR-sanctioned races, including even those in Florida.
When he wouldn't have a big enough field of the Sportsman Modified, he would call and just tell Daddy, and then we would build 2 or 3 cars instead of taking one car. Yeah, we've taken as many as 3, and some of them were flat-toed, some of them were on a trailer. Yep, so, yep, we would take them all the way down there.
Bill France honored Melvin's loyalty by designating Georgetown Speedway a NASCAR-sanctioned track. NASCAR driver standings were built on a point system, which a driver could only accumulate by racing on NASCAR tracks. Melvin Speedway now attracted nationally known drivers.
Back then, the point system was much different than it is today. And so you had these, NASCAR sanctioned tracks all over the place. And pretty much, if you could run them, you could gain as much points as you had. So you would have guys like Frankie Snyder racing over in Baltimore at a NASCAR track, one night, getting on the ferry, changing his car up on the ferry on the ride over to Delaware, and then coming and racing Georgetown Speedway the next day. And it was really, you had guys traveling as much as they could and racing as much as they could to accumulate as much points as they could.
NASCAR sanctioning brought regional drivers to Georgetown Speedway. Sometimes the race promoter would sweeten the pot so local drivers would be more likely to take on these out-of-town celebrities.
They want to beat the locals. They don't want the locals to take all the gravy. So back then, there were such things as bounty on the winners. And bounty on the winner is if a winner, say a driver has won 6, 8, 10 races, well, the promoter would put a bounty on them. And that would make more people come out and see who's going to collect the bounty. Now, the criteria was that the driver of that automobile and that automobile had to be rolling at the end of the race. You couldn't take him out and get the bounty, in other words.
By this time, building a truly competitive race car required a resourceful mechanic who could scour junkyards to find the ideal parts to combine into a high-performance vehicle.
The first car we got from Lynn Paxton and his owners, the 55 Chevrolet, very similar to this one. No motor, no transmission, no rear end. We got a 427 Chevy motor and put in it. They were just out and they were doing really well. And we got one used that needs some parts. We fixed that up. We got a radiator off a Ford truck. We got a rear end out of a 37 Ford milk truck. And then we used Buick brake drums and backing plates.
But mechanics also had to be constantly looking for anything that might give their car even the smallest advantage.
We would go to the races and look at other people's cars and see what they were running. I've crawled underneath cars, looked at them. I got every magazine I could get and read it. I got National Speed Sport News, read that, and you'd go through those papers and magazines cover to cover, and maybe you get one little line out of a story that would help you.
This constant drive to improve vehicle performance prompted track owners and promoters to respond by developing car equipment regulations to level the playing field and ensure their customers close, competitive races.
The regulations for the race cars then evolved over time as drivers tried to get around the rules, as trying to increase the speed of their cars or make modifications to the technical components of their vehicles. Then rules would be implemented the following year to either help those technical innovations be made into the sport or to deter drivers from doing some of the things that were giving them an edge over competition.
This pattern of mechanics seeking better car performance, followed by track promoter regulation, is a dynamic that has always been part of this intensely competitive sport.
People get hooked onto it and they just, if you got a rule, they'll go to the rule and then they try to go a little bit more at that racing.
What I have found, it takes 5 years normally to build a good foundation or class. And that by the 5th year, you've already reached the peak, because those who want to accelerate have found the gray areas, the illegal areas, whatever area you want to call it.
But this is just part of the natural cycle of the sport and why there are various types of cars racing each weekend. Each of these car classes, or divisions, has evolved from this process.
If the technological change is happening at a steady rate where each year it costs more and more to participate in that division in terms of engine costs, car maintenance, tires, then eventually it's going to be too expensive for some people to participate. And drivers are going to start to have a conversation with promoters that says, hey, this is getting to be too expensive. We want to still race, but we can't afford to race anymore. And then what a promoter might do is form a new division of cars. So you still have that entry-level class that's $2,000 to participate, but now you have a car that's very similar with slightly different rules that allows people that want to spend more to participate in this new division that's formed, that maybe has $5,000, $6,000 in an entry level for a car.
70 years in the pursuit of ever faster cars has produced multiple car classes and very expensive high-performance racing machines. But while car costs have skyrocketed, dirt track racing remains a hobby sport, and the rewards of winning a race are not much different than when junkers ran weekly on the tracks.
I think all car owners lose money. They truly do this as a passion almost. It's their competitive outlet.
I made money one time racing, 1972. Back then you done everything yourself. You build motors. My wife would come over and let me wash motors and build motors. You didn't buy nothing. So in 72, at the end of the year, I had $7,000 left over. And to me, being a fool, what do you think I done with that $7,000? I bought me a race car motor. Oh, a buddy of mine said, man, we need a motor.
In auto racing, there are a lot of different components. And no matter how good a driver you are, if your equipment is subpar, you're not going to excel. So the money equation is really very much a part of auto racing.
You can't run a season with even the best luck in the world and pay for it because the expenses of racing. The car investment, the motor motors nowadays $45,000 does 60. And holy mackerel, we got $80,000 tied up. We ain't got no tires, we ain't got no fuel, we ain't got no pit passes. And no, there is no money to be made racing dirt.
By the late 50s, dirt track racing was a major recreational outlet on Delmarva. But while there were plenty of fans, there were simply too many tracks running too many races.
Too many tracks racing too close together and offering racing programs on almost a nightly basis. So if there's too many tracks in the area and not enough cars, then some of those tracks start to close down.
One reason car counts had dropped was because backyard mechanics were finding their hobby becoming too expensive.
Late 50s, in the early 60s, the junkyards were cleaned out of these bodies. There were none around. And in that same time, the street rod movement was catching fire. And the guys were going in. If it was a nice body, they would give a lot of money for it to make a street rod out where they could drive it on the highway.
The growing popularity of street rods not only drove up the cost of dirt track cars, it prompted a major shift in American car manufacturing and the public's automotive interests.
By the early 1960s, GM and Ford are starting to look at all these hot rods and say, hey, how can we get into this? So then they start to offer their own lines of power vehicles, muscle cars, in order to compete with what people are building in their own backyards.
At the same time, NASCAR was growing its fan base by promoting racing on new asphalt super tracks.
That was a new draw, to have these huge speedways that they could say were over a mile in length, which was unheard of at that period, and then have these longer endurance races that had a different culture with the pit stops. So the interest changed in these long races by being able to keep your car competitive throughout the whole race.
Where asphalt racing tests drivers and cars over time, dirt racing is a brief, intense experience for all involved.
The majority of our races are 25 and 30 laps. A special race may be 50 laps. So yeah, if your business is right in front of you, you better hurry up and get it done.
If you go to Daytona or a paved track, it tends to be pretty much the same. Let's hope so. You know, the track's the same. If you go to a dirt track, it can be wet one night, it can be dry another night, it can be rough one night where the track develops holes, or you know, the dirt might mound up and give a cushion as we talk about. So there are a lot of different variables. You'll go to a dirt track and it'll never be the same.
Meanwhile, another racing sport, drag racing, was getting popular at this time as well. In '64, the Cathell family built and opened Delmarva's first drag strip in Delmar, on the border of Delaware and Maryland. They soon added a dirt track, which a promoter leased and ran on Friday nights. They all soon realized it wasn't drawing fans.
They had a half-mile track, but the fans were on this side of the drag strip. The stock car track was on the other side of the drag strip. Finally come to the conclusion, talking with George Bowers, which owned the old Delmar Speedway out there. He told Dad, he said, your fans are so far away, they don't feel the speed.
Dirt track racing is dirt, so you may take a little home with you, you know, depending on the night or where you're sitting or which way the wind's blowing. But for the people that enjoy the dirt track racing, that's all part of the experience.
So early in '69, the Cathells built a new track next to the grandstands and instead began running on Saturday nights. Fridays were left for Little Lincoln, a smaller, less developed track that is fondly remembered to this day.
For 5 hours, you got to see a fight, you got something decent to eat, you got to see a race, you could fall in love, and you could get drunk for 5 hours.
Everybody rushed home from work, you know, got loaded up and went to Little Lincoln. And it was just a rough and tumble, you know, like, you know, call a lot of tracks like that, bull rings, you know, it's just back in the woods, quarter mile, and racing was always close. Crowds were always very vocal and opinionated about what was going on, but it was a fun place.
And we would race Friday night Little Lincoln, Saturday night Delmar, and Sunday at Georgetown. And I flagged them all. So there again, same cars, same drivers, same family. And it just got closer and closer as we progressed in years.
Meanwhile, Melvin Joseph had sold Georgetown Speedway, but had not lost his interest in racing cars and horses. He was looking for a new construction and racing challenge.
Well, he was in with Rollins, and there was Mr. Buxton, and they needed to do something. They wanted to do a horse track, and they didn't think that that would go on its own. So my father came up with the idea of making it inside of a racetrack and having it be a perfect mile and everything. So he designed and built it along with our engineer here.
Melvin realized his vision with the construction of Dover International Speedway, or the Monster Mile. Its opening coincided with another promotional opportunity for NASCAR, and one that further separated asphalt from dirt racing fans.
At the time they built Dover in '69, NASCAR was still running dirt, but television was coming in. And when the cars would get dirty, the TV cameras couldn't see the car number, and they couldn't see the driver's name, and they didn't look pretty on TV. So TV pushed for asphalt.
I think that NASCAR is now a made-for-TV event, and that the bulk of their revenues are derived from television and not the live gate, not the spectators. So consequently, their decisions are based on making it a better TV product and not always a better live event.
NASCAR has grown so big at this point that fans are very much separated from the pit area. They might have a favorite team or a favorite driver, but that's not someone that they know. It's someone that then they're rooting for, but they don't have that personal connection to that individual, which makes grassroots dirt track racing so much more exciting.
NASCAR is now second only to the National Football League in its popularity and fan base in the United States. At the same time, the sport from which it sprang continues on a smaller scale in areas across the country, such as Delmarva. While the racing remains intense, the crowds are smaller, and the race cars are built very differently.
For so many years, stock car racing was about families that worked right there in their shop. They built, handcrafted all their stuff, fixed it. Today's world, I hate to use that expression, is all a bought race car.
No one goes really to a junkyard anymore to get parts. That's something of the past. You're going to this group of speed equipment manufacturers who are producing the different parts, and then you put all of those parts together yourself to build your car.
While local heroes racing $30,000 to $80,000 cars attract the most fans, there is an ongoing need to recruit new blood if the sport is going to continue. But novice drivers can't afford such vehicles.
Racing, actually, from a promotion standpoint, you have two different factors. You tend to have a premier division at your speedway where your heroes compete. And by your heroes, I mean the guys that get the most exposure through the media. They would be the drivers that would have the most fans. They'd be the drivers that get the most money in the payoffs on a night. But you constantly need to have people coming into the sport and hopefully into your speedway. And the way that you do that is trying to maintain an entry-level division like the Delmarva Chargers.
The Delmarva Chargers are one of two entry-level divisions. The other is the Delaware Super Trucks. Both are considered a hobby class because they recall the earlier days of dirt track, when drivers and mechanics resurrected passenger cars from junkyards, added safety equipment, and took them to the track. Both classes began in Delaware, and the Chargers are now raced in Virginia and Ohio. However, the Super Trucks are a unique class, raced only on Delmarva dirt tracks.
This is my everyday car. It's an '04 Chevy Cavalier.
Looks like a normal car.
This is my drive every day to work car. It's the same thing as my race car though. The only difference is this one's automatic. And this is the race car. This is an 03 Chevy Cavalier.
Yeah.
The only difference, this one's manual. And this one no longer has a windshield or any windows at all. We had to put a roll cage in it. We're all about safety in this class. You have to bolt in a racing seat. We have 5-point harness. We have to wear helmets. We have to wear neck braces and fire-resistant suits.
The trick for us is to try to keep those entry-level divisions as inexpensive as possible. Most of your entry-level divisions now tend to be 4-cylinder divisions that are able to be pulled from a junkyard.
The Chargers and trucks are great because it's an entry-level point. If you're sitting in the stands here at Georgetown, you say, I want to race, chances are you don't have $100,000 to buy a modified operation, but you might be able to come up with a pickup.
We have a lot of people that come out to watch the Chargers in the truck.
Right.
You know, the Chargers are known to be a little bit aggressive, the trucks are known to be a little aggressive, and people like that. They want to see that, you're battling for that lead spot.
Competition doesn't necessarily have to be a big block modified or a super late model. Those trucks, super trucks, if they're 3 wide, that's competition. And I know it's a lot slower, but at least they're racing and they're competitive with each other.
We got like 20, 21 trucks most of the time. So you figure $35 a pop getting in or $25 a pop getting in the pits, and most of us have 3 or 4 people that are coming in the pits with us. That adds up for some money for Charlie and Brett.
Yeah. We need those people. We need people racing. And look at the counts we've been getting. I mean, we've been over 20 trucks many times this year, 15 Chargers. So we're looking at 35 race teams here who are able to do it on a budget, and they bring their friends and family and pit crew members, and that all contributes to what we're doing here, and that brings a lot of local people into the stands. People want to see if they see their neighbor out there 7 nights a week working on this thing, they want to see what it does. And those people that may never been to a race before come here to see those people. So I think that the Chargers and trucks keep our local, the local part of our speedway going and gets the neighboring people out, and more so than maybe the bigger professional teams.
The racing fan base continues to age, and there's not a lot of new people coming to the Speedway. People who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s grew up around cars. They grew up around that interest of tinkering on their cars in their backyard, and they came to the Speedway because there wasn't a lot of other leisure activities available to them in these rural communities. Today, though, we see that teens are drawn to a variety of different entertainment features.
The kids have got the electronics, the games. Also, right around here, Ocean City and Rehoboth has expanded. That takes away every little thing that the family gets involved in takes away from the seat in the racetrack.
There's a certain number of people that just don't want to sit in the grandstands and get dirty and have to wash their car. And I think the cost of the actual race vehicles has hurt us, as an industry.
Back in the day, we went to the junkyard and got a frame, made a stock car. Today, it's R&R, remove and replace. They don't make parts, they just order parts.
Now the trucks and maybe the Chargers, you go get your toolbox out and the darts and you put it back as best that you can. But our other class cars are custom built cars.
So, in all honesty, it takes money to race today.
But there are also growing pressures off the track.
I think that development has certainly decreased the number of speedways that are in the country.
A racetrack, if it's in a metropolitan area, at some point, the value of the property far exceeds what you can produce in revenue.
I think the strong places will survive. I think we'll have fewer tracks in 10 years than we have today. I think you have to adjust the way you do business. I think what we're doing here, not running every week, running once a month, making it special when we do open the gates, I think there's a future for that.
NASCAR racing is long, and sometimes it can get boring. The cars get pulled apart, and not everyone in today's society has 5 hours to sit down and watch a race from green flag to checker flag. But a dirt track race you can go to on a Saturday night, and in 3 or 4 hours you can see 4 or 5 different styles of racing, and it's boom, 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 and it's exciting, it's fast, and I think as in a mobile society that has a short attention span, I think that has a lot of marketability. So I think you see crowds starting to come back up in some places.
The people that remain the base of the dirt track demographic are those people that have family ties to the sport, the people that come with their parents, their grandparents to the track, and they gain an interest in continuing to patronize automobile racing over a growing variety of other entertainment features in their local communities.
Obviously, Delaware International has been there forever. Charlie's done a good job keeping his gates open for years and years and years. And having Georgetown working together with him and not trying to butt heads, we can both enjoy the pool of passionate people that there are for racing in Delaware.
The way you make a fan is to take their interest and develop that so that they know who the players are. And one advantage that racing has is we have a tremendous cast of colorful characters that compete in these divisions and on these racetracks. It takes a special type of guy or woman to do that. And their stories, the stories of the race teams and the stories of the race drivers are really what make the sport come alive. And that's what keeps racing strong.